Hello. Welcome to today's webinar, Undisbursed Community Development Block Grant Funds at Risk of Cancellation 2016 grants. Thank you for joining us today. If you are a regular attender of our IDIS webinars, glad to have you back. If you're a first-time attendee, we hope you'll find today's session to be helpful. My name is Rob Strauntz. I'm with the Cloudburst Group, today's host for this webinar. I have with me today my colleagues from the Cloudburst Group, John Coons, Susan Walsh, and Laura Dietert. We also have Tarek Labuda and TJ Winfield working behind the scenes today. Today we have Robert Peterson, Director of the States and Small Cities Division, joining us from HUD's Office of Block Grant Assistance. He's joined by Jane Wilson and Aaron Martin. Robert, did you want to say a few words before we dive into the details?
Yeah, thank you, Rob. Thank you for joining today's webinar. It's important for us, important for you to pay attention to funds before they expire and to draw them down. It's pretty straightforward. It makes it difficult for us to justify our budget request to Congress when grantees leave money on the table. So in today's webinar, you'll find ways to make sure that you're spending all your funds. For those of you that have been around for years, this is kind of a newish thing. We used to have first in, first out accounting that did this job for you. It would spend down those oldest grants first. But now, since we've transitioned to grant-based accounting, as you know, it is your responsibility to ensure that you're spending those earliest grants first. Today's webinar is a technical webinar about finding those funds and putting them towards activities to get them drawn down. There are additional things that you can do as well. Besides the content of this webinar, there are things you can do to increase your expenditure rate, to make more grants, to make larger grants, and spend more funds overall, and manage really your risk of having funds expire. So thank you for your attention to this topic, and thank you for joining today.
Thank you, Robert. A couple of housekeeping slides here. Our session today is scheduled for 60 minutes. The host has muted all attendees. Video and screen sharing has been disabled. For the best experience, we encourage you to close email, messaging, and other applications that may consume bandwidth or serve as a distraction. Webinar materials will be posted in about 2 weeks from today as we finalize and review the transcript and recording. There is a lot of material to cover today, but we do hope to have time for a live Q&A at the end of the hour, to have about 5 or 10 minutes, we hope. If you have technical questions during the webinar, Zoom or otherwise, please use the chat feature of the Zoom to chat at host and panelists. The other members of the Cloudburst team will be monitoring the chat as presenters are speaking, and will be able to respond to you to help you out. If, however, you have a question related to the content of the session, please use the Q&A feature of Zoom. Cloudburst team and HUD will be watching the Q&A. If we can answer them as others are presenting, we will. Otherwise, we'll collect them and respond to them at the end of the hour during our Q&A time. HUD is also offering grantees office hours June 26th and 27th. To meet with a TA provider to review your individual situation and help you to resolve any problems you have encountered, or any unanswered questions you have remaining after this session today about your individual situation. A news item will be going out with a link to submit that request for office hours. So when you see that, if you do need some help, we're here to walk you through the process and get these funds spent. And finally, this webinar is funded through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, Office of Community Planning and Development. And with that, I'll hand it over to our first presenter, John Coons.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Robert, as well. Robert Peterson gave a great introduction, I thought, to why you're here and why even some of you longer-term grantee staff might find this process a bit new, as grants-based accounting took over from FIFO a few years ago. So, let me run over to today's session. For today's session, we hope you come away with a couple of things. We hope you come away with a better understanding of two key areas to help avoid losing any of your 2016 grant funds. First, how to find, release, and reallocate undisbursed 2016 grant funds. And then second, how to take steps needed to draw all of your 2016 grant funds by the September 27th, 2023 deadline. For our agenda, excuse me, we'll start with a brief overview, and then we'll cover how to determine your 2016 grant commitments and grant balances. We'll look at how to find unexpended 2016 grant funds, which may be simple or it may be more involved. Like when you have funds tied up with activity 2. Finally, we'll dive into some specifics and considerations for committing and drawing the 2016 grant before they are at risk of recapture. If you're a new grantee or if you're a grantee with unexpended 2016 grant funds, this webinar is designed especially for you. If you don't, you may want to stick around if you have any concerns for when your 2017 or later grants reach their expenditure deadline. We'll also cover a few areas and few topics that may be useful to that are beyond the immediate purpose of the webinar. But the focus really here is to make sure that grantees do not lose their 2016 funds when they expire. So why do 2016 grant balances matter now? Well, because any 2016 funds not dispersed by this September 27th will automatically be recaptured by Treasury with no way to get them back. Funds that could be supporting your community could be instantly lost. Specifically, you have until the 27th to approve any draws. However, please give yourself a few extra days. Give a little bit of leeway. As you well know, stuff sometimes happens. In 2023, the 27th is on a Wednesday, so we suggest approving all your draws by, say, that Monday, September 25th. You may have unexpected internal roadblocks arise, or even on a few occasions, LOCs may not process a payment overnight. In fact, I think there were some delays for folks in the last few days. I don't think HUD has any discretion to protect you from Treasury recapturing those funds if anything goes wrong. So really focus on being a little bit prepared early. Most of you have probably completed all of your 2016 action plan activities, perhaps years ago. So why do we still have 2016 funds available? Here are a few reasons. While you may have once committed all of your 2016 your 2016 grant to your 2016 action plan activities, some of them may have been canceled or come in under budget. Or as you're supposed to, you may have used program income you received while in 2016. Activity is still away, and rather than drawing down, used the program income rather than drawing down against entitlement funds. Using program income is required in this case will free up the entitlement funds for use in other activities. In any of these cases, however, any balance remaining when these activities are completed will be released to the line of credit. Tracking and reallocating entitlement funds either during the program year or as part of each annual action plan will help you ensure that your old grant funds are used. But even with this approach, you may still have some funds that are never reprogrammed. Another reason your 2016 funds may remain is that a grantee repaid HUD for ineligible costs, but did not take a few of the necessary steps to complete the process. Essentially, and we'll cover this more later, HUD puts these funds back into the grantee line of credit and associates the credit with activity 2, where they'll remain until the grantee applies the credit to the original activity. All right, so now let's look at the 4 primary steps to take to avoid losing your 2016 grant funds. The first step is to know the status of your grant balance, which is a little bit more involved than just finding the balance amount. Second, find out precisely where those funds, where those unexpended funds reside, down to the activity level. Third and fourth step are to commit the 2015 funds and then spend them by the deadline. These 2 steps may involve developing a spending plan and reallocating 2016 funds to faster moving activities. Susan will now start walking you through the process.
Thanks, John. So let's talk about how we can see the balance of the 2016 CDBG grant. We're going to look at how we can see what's committed, what isn't committed, what needs to be drawn, and all these different details of the grant. So the first way to look at this is just to look live in the system. And so this is an occasion where you may want to see your grant in IDIS. So you can go to your grant tab at the top of the screen, and then you can just simply search for CDBG, and you can put in 2016 if you're interested in that year. If you leave the year blank, it will show all of your years with the most recent on top. And then just click search, and it will bring you then to another screen that shows some summary information about that grant. You can see here, it shows you the current authorized amount, the net drawn amount, and also the grant balance. Now, if you click view, and there is no edit feature here because this is just your grant information, so you would just simply click view. And that's when you're going to see some more information about the grant. So on this slide, you see just the top of the screen, and this just gives you some basic information that your grant status hopefully is active, your grant is not blocked, and it has an obligation date, which is probably the date that you and HUD signed your grant agreement. If you go further down on the screen, then you'll see some more detailed information. Now, this slide just shows you pieces of that information. It's not showing you the entire screen. So there's actually more detailed information within these categories, but we wanted to feature mainly 3 parts of this grant screen. And so the top of it is showing your original allocation amount and your current authorized amount. Now, normally these both would be the same. There was a case a year or 2 ago when there was some grant adjustments that had to be made for quite a few grantees across the country. So there was an adjustment made, and so you may see that those are different. But the important thing here is that the current authorized amount is the amount of your grant that you have in your Treasury account. And then in the middle part of the screen is the draw information, and this shows you the net drawn amount, and then your IDIS draw balance, which should also match your LOCS draw balance. And then finally, at the bottom, you'll see amount committed to activities and amount available to commit to activities. Now, there's more, like I said, there's a little bit more information, some detailed information about maybe pending draws and the draw information. So take a look at that screen sometime, and it's really helpful information. And I just wanted to point out here, there is a sub-fund option to see sub-funds. I know most CDBG grantees don't use the sub-fund feature, which is available for both AD for administration and SU for subrecipient. But if you happen to use that feature, then you do have to make sure that you don't have any funds hidden in your sub-funds. But we won't really spend any time on that today. Now, the other way to see this information is in a report, and the PRO1 report is a really good report to see your grant balances, and it shows also your program income balances by year. And when you run this report, you can just run it for CDBG. It's actually best not to run it for the other programs because it shows CDBG the best on this format. And on each grant, there will be a line for showing amount committed to activities, the net drawn amount, and then available to commit and available to draw. And so just one thing to keep in mind for reports in MicroStrategy, that they always follow the actual data changes in IDIS by 1 day. So if you've done a draw today, you won't see, if you just created the draw today, you won't see it on the PRO1 if you run it today. However, open vouchers, which are vouchers that have not yet been approved or completed, will show up on the PRO1, I'm sorry. So if you do create a voucher today and then you run the report tomorrow, you should see that, that draw reflected on the report. Now, let's take a kind of a deeper dive into each of these different categories now and see how much, what we want to look at first is how much CDBG grant do we have that we have committed? How much do we need to commit? How does this compare to our total grant? So in this bar graph, you can see the current authorized amount. Again, that's the amount of our grant, is made up of basically the amount that is already committed to activities or funded to activities. We kind of use that terminology interchangeably for CDBG. And then the amount available to commit. And those two amounts total the current authorized amount. So if we take a look at this graph, and we can see that the current authorized amount is 1.4 million, and the amount committed to activities is 1,220,000, then we can see that the amount available to commit is that balance. And this is how much we need to commit to activities. We need to fund to activities. Now, we can also look at that same information for our draw. How much do we need to draw? And so in the same way, we have our current authorized amount, which is made up of our net drawn amount, the amount we've already drawn from IDIS, and the amount available to draw. Those two total the current authorized amount. And so in this example, we see that we have an authorized amount of the 1.4 million. We've drawn 1.2 million. And so we have 200,000 available to draw. Now what we want to do is compare these two. And so we are going to compare the amount that we have available to commit to the amount that we have available to draw. And we can see that the amount that we have available to commit is 180,000, but the amount that we have available to draw is 200,000. So what does that tell us? Well, let's compare those two numbers. And so we can see that we have the amount available to draw, the 200,000, the amount available to commit, 180,000. Now we'll go to the next. We want to subtract those two amounts, and we will see that that's $20,000. And so that's funds that are committed but not yet drawn. So this means that this $20,000 is funded in activities. It's already committed, but it still needs to be drawn down. In addition to that, we have the 180,000 that is not yet committed, not yet funded to any activities, and needs to be funded to activities before it can be drawn. So now I'm going to pass it back over to John. And he's going to talk a little bit about how you find these unexpended funds.
Thanks, Susan. So let's move on to step number 2, finding unexpended 2016 funds. So grantees will find their unexpended 2016 funds in one of three places. Susan talked about the first category, funds that are not committed to any activity or obscured for some other reason. These funds are in plain sight and available to commit to activities. The second area we're going to look at are those funds that are committed to activities but not yet drawn. We will show you how to find them in a moment. The key point is that you want to evaluate each of the activities funded by the remaining 2016 grant to see if they will be expended by the September 27th deadline, which is about 3.5 months from now. If you can draw the money by that time in their current activity, then no action is needed. But if you have slower moving activities that are funded with this 2016 grant, you may need to move these funds to faster moving activities that will need the draws by the deadline. If you move the 2016 funds, then you will replace them with newer grants. Finally, the third category are unresolved vouchers associated with activity number 2. Susan will go over that in much greater detail in a few minutes. Now let's focus on the second category. How do you find the open activities funded with your 2016 CDBG grant? One option is to go into activity funding screen in IDIS and search for open activities and then look at each one to see if there's undrawn 2016 grant funds. This may work for some of you smaller grantees that just have a few activities, but it would be time consuming and painful if you had more than a few open activities. So introducing the use of the PR26 CDBG Activity Summary by Selected Grant Report as a tool for Plain Detective. Many grantees are familiar with this report when demonstrating that they have not exceeded the planning and administration cap for their origin year test. But it's also a terrific report for finding funding by grant year at the activity level. The report is organize your activities by the grant year funding the activity and essentially ignores the action plan year. It groups activities first by grant year and then by activity category, typically matrix code series. So those groupings of matrix codes that are for similar types of work of eligible activities. You can run the report for a single grant year or for more than one grant year. So you'll find the report we're looking for in the PR26 folder in MicroStrategy. You'll see there are 3 reports. The first one is the one you may have been using for years, the CDBG, the PR26 Financial Summary Report. On the right side, you have this CDBG CV Financial Summary Report just for your CARES Act funding, CDBG CARES Act funding. And then the one we want to highlight is the PR26 Activity Summary by Selected Grant. And that's the one you'll want to select. Once you select the PR26 CDBG Activity Summary by Selected Grant Year, that's a mouthful, you just need to select one or more of the grants to include. So in this case, we're only interested in selecting the 2016 grant year, but you could also run it for many years at once. I think it really works well for at least from 2015 through the current year. It will separate out, if you do run it for multiple years, it does separate the grant years in the report. So it's just your choice. And you just do that by moving them over to right. I think most of you are probably familiar with running reports. This image looks at just a small part of the report to illustrate how you find committed but undrawn grant funds by activity. So there's a middle column just right of the activity status where you're going to find this information that focuses on the grant year you selected. So if you ran it for one report, it'll be for that particular grant year, or it'll be the portion of the report that highlights the particular grant year. In this case, we're going to look at the 2016 grant. You can see activity 3650. It's an open activity that was funded for $32,514 of 2016 grant dollars. However, there has been no draws made against the 2016 entitlement grant. So bingo, we know where 32,000 or so of the undrawn grant years are residing. Now you just need to determine if you can draw the 2016 funds on that current activity you're looking at, or if you need to move them to another faster moving activity. We'll talk about that later. Now for the third category, dealing with unresolved vouchers associated with activity 2. So hopefully many of you will have found all of your unexpected balances by now, and just looking at the PR 26 report we talked about and looking at your uncommitted balance. But say you still have some unexpended 2016 funds that are not accounted for after adding up the amounts that are already available for funding and those that are committed to an activity but are not drawn yet. If you still can't find all the money, then there's a pretty good chance you need to look for unresolved vouchers associated with activity 2. So what is activity number 2? It was a special activity set up for CDBG back in the Stone Age, in the mid-1990s, when IDS was just born. So back then it was used just to migrate historical data into IDIS. However, since then it serves a couple of roles. You may see vouchers associated with activities that reflect this role. So if your grantee has a Section 108 loan, HUD will take funds from your line of credit in locks if you happen to miss a payment for debt service. HUD will then, with those, enter a voucher in activity 2 to reflect the funds taken for the Section 108 debt service, and these funds will show a positive amount. The third category are return funds for either overdrawn or ineligible CDBG activities. So this may have happened to more of you. In this case, after a grantee returns the CDBG funds, HUD enters a credit against activity 2, and that voucher will show up as a negative. So here's an example of what you may see in IDIS if you have a credit voucher return funds that are still in activity 2. So again, that's if you return funds for ineligible expenses and so forth. Those return funds show as committed to activities and is available to draw. So in this example, IDIS says that you have nothing available to commit, but you also have 37,000 available to draw. If you still can't find the undrawn 37,000 committed to an open activity, or if those funds are not committed to any, you really may find them committed in activity number 2, and you just have not done some steps to resolve that yet. So on the other hand, just manual payments for missed Section 108 payments show up a little differently, which Susan will talk about in a minute.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yep.
All right, so again, as John mentioned, these vouchers in activity 2 may be either a debit, which shows up as a positive voucher just like if you create a voucher, it takes money from your account. And these debits are typically the missed Section 108 payments where HUD took those funds from your LOCS account. Or there may be a credit, which is shown as a negative voucher with brackets around it. And again, this is for funds returned to HUD. It could have been for ineligible costs, ineligible activities, even perhaps duplicate payments. Say you drew something twice and you had to return some of the money, or you drew money in advance of really the need, so you had to return that money back to your line of credit. Many different reasons that you might have had to do this, but if you did, then those credits will be reflected in activity number 2. Now, the first thing that you can do is just check to see, is there a balance in activity number 2? And so just simply look in the funding screen in IDIS and just look at the activity funding for activity number 2. Now, this is only going to give you a view option because activity 2, you're not allowed to edit the funding for activity 2. And so it's only going to show as a view option. So if you click on view, then you can just compare the drawn amount to the funded amount. And if those amounts are exactly the same, then that means that you don't have any credits or debits that are in activity 2 that you need to deal with. But if those drawn amount and funded amounts don't match, then that's telling you that there is either a negative or a positive voucher or vouchers that need to be taken care of in activity 2. And so you'll need to look further. And generally, if the funded amount is more than the drawn amount, then that means that you do have a credit voucher. And if the drawn amount exceeds the funded amount, that means that you have that debit or that manual payment that was taken from your LOCS account that has to be dealt with as well. So the other so now once you realize that you may need to look at the information in activity 2, you can actually search for the vouchers, and we're going to show you how you can see it live in the system and also on a report. So on the funding drawdown page of IDIS, if you go to the left-hand side and you go to drawdown search voucher, it will bring you to the search voucher screen. And this screen, you may be used to searching by voucher number, but in this case, you can also search by activity number for activity 2 or any activity. And so just enter activity 2 in the IDIS activity ID field. And we do recommend that you clear out the earliest creation date, which is a field that is defaulted to right now. It's defaulted to January 1st of 2017. And it just may not capture perhaps something that happened in 16. So we do want to just make sure you don't miss anything. So go ahead and clear that out. What that will then show you when you do a search is all the vouchers that have been in activity 2 from the beginning. Now, you may see quite a few. You may see some that say converted voucher because, as John mentioned earlier, there was when IDIS was first, the version of IDIS as we know it was first used, there were funds that had to be reconciled into the system, and these were all put in as converted vouchers. You may see revised vouchers, and revised vouchers are just historical. You don't really have to worry about those. And then the main thing is you want to look to see what you have that are completed vouchers. And for the purposes of today's webinar, we're mostly focused on 2016. Of course, we want you to address the vouchers in activity 2 as soon as possible. So you don't want to wait until it's getting close to when that grant is expiring, but you should actually be addressing the vouchers right away. And so this will give you a chance to look in there and see if you have any newer vouchers. But for this purpose, we're specifically looking at 2016. So here we see a couple of different examples, some positive, some negative. You can see that sometimes these numbers are the same, they bounce. So if it's a positive and a negative, those balance each other out. And then let's look a little bit more. Now, I mentioned that you can also see it in a report. And again, because it's MicroStrategy, it won't whatever you changed today won't be seen until tomorrow. But if you haven't made any changes, you can go ahead and run either a PRO5 or a PRO7 report. The PRO5 report is a nice report to just run for a specific activity. It shows you all of the completed vouchers for that activity. So it's not going to show you revised vouchers, but it will show you converted vouchers for activity number 2. So you could run that for activity 2. You could also run a PRO7 report, which you could then download it into Excel and filter for activity number 2 and to see all the historical vouchers as well. So looking a little bit more at these examples, we can see that there may be a revised voucher, as I mentioned earlier, that's historical, and that in that case, you're not going to be having to do anything with it. It's just a historical reference that there was a voucher there and it was revised. In this example, we also see just a negative completed voucher and a positive completed voucher. So addressing the negative completed vouchers will then give you, those are funds that you repaid to your line of credit. And once those are resolved, which we'll show you in a minute, then that will free up that money to make it available for you to draw down. Right now, it's stuck in activity number 2. The positive vouchers, on the other hand, are funds that were already taken from your line of credit. And so until those are resolved and addressed and put to the proper activity, it's going to incorrectly show that you may have funds available to commit when you really don't. So that's another reason that you really need to get these vouchers resolved. So another view of this, again, for these negative vouchers, most likely were returned for either overdrawn funds or ineligible activity costs. In some cases, grantees even return funds to one particular grant year because maybe they drew from one year and they really meant to draw from a different year. So there's another reason, you just, for whatever reason, that you needed to put that money back into your line of credit. These will all show as a negative amount, and they do normally are reflected as CO, which stands for collection, and completed again means that it's an active voucher that's reflecting funds in that activity. So what you have to do then is, as part of the process when you return money to your line of credit, then HUD will reflect those return funds in activity 2 as that credit voucher or that negative voucher. But your final step is that you have to then revise that voucher to an activity so that those funds can be freed up. So in this case, we see that there's one that says revised. And so that means that that voucher was already revised to another activity. And you can see that if you click on view. We're not going to show you that on here, but in the system, you can click on view and it will show you all the lines of that voucher. So the process then is to revise this negative voucher to the activity that originally drew down the funds. So when you returned your money to your line of credit, you returned it for a particular draw from a particular activity. And that return funds now has to be applied back to that same activity so that it can undraw the funds and release it and allow you to use those funds again for something else. So that's the final step of returning funds. You return the funds to your line of credit, but then that final step has to take place where you apply those return funds to that activity. And the funds have to match the same grant year as the original activity draw. So if you're returning funds for an activity that drew 2016 funds, then when you return that money to HUD, you have to indicate in that wire memo that these funds are 2016. That's why it's very important to put the grant year that reflects the year of the money that was drawn. It doesn't care about what action plan year the activity was from. What it cares about is what grant year the funds were drawn from. Also, it has to be the same grant type in the sense that you don't want to ever return funds to your line of credit if you drew program income, because program income funds are locally held funds and your EN funds are your treasury funds. So they have to be at least treasury to treasury. Now, if you are one of the few grantees out there that uses the AD subfund or SU subfund, you actually can return funds. They will show up as EN, and you can actually revise those if those original draws were AD or SU. That was a feature that was fixed in the system quite a few years ago, so don't worry about that. But what's the most important information here is that you don't ever want to return funds to your line of credit or to the treasury account for funds that you originally drew locally, like program income or revolving loan funds. So when you do revise those vouchers, it will then undraw the money. You will see that those funds no longer will show in the activity as drawn, but they will still be in the activity funding. They will still be in the funded amount of the activity, but no longer show as drawn. And then if you don't need those funds in that activity anymore, you can release those funds. You can edit the funding to remove those funds from that activity. And now they will be in that category called available for funding or available to commit. And you can use those where you are going to be able to fund and draw down those funds. So for the purposes of this webinar, we're talking about 2016 funds. We want to release those funds. If that activity where they're funded is not going to draw those funds by the deadline, then you want to release those out of that activity and put them in an activity where they will be able to be drawn before the deadline. There is a very helpful memo that's available on the HUD Exchange, and it goes through all of these steps for returning funds to the line of credit. Now, remember, there are two different ways to return funds, and so there's also a process where you can return funds to the local account. So you always have to make sure you check with your field office before returning any funds to first make sure you're doing it the proper way, the way that they want you to do it, and you're using the right grant numbers and so forth. So this memo explains the different ways of returning funds, but it also goes through the step-by-step and how to revise the voucher, this return funds voucher, if you have one, to the activity. Now, let's talk for a minute about manual payment vouchers. And as John mentioned earlier, these are funds taken from LOCs for missed Section 108 loan repayments. And so it's going to be a positive amount. It's going to be an amount where HUD literally took it from your line of credit and put in a voucher in Activity 2 to reflect that this money was drawn from your CDBG account. They display as completed MP. Sometimes they will show up as AD, completed AD, which means adjustment, but most of the time they say MP. And if they're revised, again, that's historical, and that just means that there was a manual payment and that has now been revised. But the main thing about these payments is that they really need to be put in the proper activity in IDIS. They really shouldn't be in Activity 2. They need to be put into the Section 108 repayment activity so that they're correctly reflected in the right place and funded properly. But there are times when you will see a manual payment for a positive amount and either a CO voucher or an AD voucher for a negative amount, and these amounts offset each other. So in that case, of course, you wouldn't want to revise those vouchers because they balance each other out. But what we do want you to do is, if you have a manual payment voucher or an AD adjustment voucher for a positive amount, then we do want you to talk to the Section 108 office first, and just to make sure, does this voucher need to be moved to the right activity, to the repayment activity, or can it be left alone in Activity 2? But if it's affecting your balance of your available to commit or available to draw, then you definitely will need to address it in some way. So we do want you to talk to them first, but if they do confirm that you do need to revise this voucher, then you need to submit a request to the IDIS Ask a Question so that we can help you submit this to the programmers who have to change it for you. Unfortunately, the system does not allow grantee users to make these revisions. And again, if you have any questions at all about these types of vouchers, either MP, AD, CO, any of the vouchers in Activity 2, please feel free to send in and ask a question and we can help you through this. So one of the things that we often get questions about is there's an old repayment, perhaps because we're talking about 2016 funds, those funds maybe were returned, they could have been returned recently, but they may have been returned quite a few years ago. And perhaps you don't know which activity these funds were returned for. So we suggest a few things you can check. First of all, monitoring reports, particularly from HUD monitorings, is a very likely place that if there was some kind of an ineligible cost, that HUD may have pointed this out and required a repayment. You could have audit reports. They could be from a self-audit, from a self-monitoring. It could be from your single audit that you have done. But any kind of audit reports may reveal this information. Look at your HUD correspondence, see if there's anything in there. And of course, feel free to reach out to your HUD field office to discuss this with them. And also, you can just simply look at the drawdowns that you originally made from that grant, in this case, 2016. So you could run a PR07 report that, and then you could filter it for just 2016 grant year draws, just to see if there's a draw that matches that returned amount. That's not necessarily always going to be the answer, because you could have returned funds for several draws that were made separately. But it's something that could perhaps help you if you can't find out otherwise. But if you've done your due diligence, you've looked at your records, you've talked to HUD, you still can't figure out which activity the funds were returned for, it is okay in that situation to revise it to your admin activity that drew that year of funds. You would only be able to revise it to one of your admin activities that drew, in this case, 2016 funds. So you would have to, of course, reopen that activity. You always have to reopen an activity if it's already completed before you can do a revision. And then you would be able to revise it to that activity, which would undraw those funds and make those funds then available for you to use again. But again, if you do have any questions about any of this process, we can, as we mentioned at the beginning, we will have some office hours. You can sign up for office hours or send in and ask a question, and we can help troubleshoot this a little bit with you and see if we can figure out what activity these funds should be applied to. So now I'm going to pass it back over to John, and he's going to talk about committing and expending these funds.
Thanks, Susan. So, yep, as Susan said, we're going to back out a little bit now and talk about how to make sure all of your 2016 grant funds are committed to the right activities so that you can draw them down by the September grant expiration date. The analysis we talked about, it may in fact show that all of your 2016 grant funds are committed to activities that are moving along and will draw them down by the summer. So if this is the case, congratulations, you're ready to go. However, for those with bigger grant balances, you may need to do more planning and avoid losing the funds. It may help to develop a spending plan to guide and communicate needed steps to move funds to faster moving activities, and then to prioritize the drawing down of the 2016 grant. The plan might be quite simple. or it may be more involved if you need to really accelerate your program activities and payment schedules. And don't forget to factor in the potential need for an annual action plan amendment to carry out your spending plan, which we'll touch on in a few minutes. So let's look closer at some of the options you have to consider to spend the funds. The first option for spending the 2016 grant is to identify activities that will draw down funds by the deadline. Some of these activities may be funded by other grant years. In this case, you'll just want to reduce the funding from the later grant years and commit the 2016 funds. So you may swap out the 2016 funds with newer funds. You can do this in the bottom of the activity funding screen. And in this example, we do see activity funded with, it's kind of small, but with 2021 grant. And let's say that needs a draw before the September deadline. So if you're confident that you would spend $20,000 by the summer, in the summer, then you can add the $20,000 to the 2016 line and just reduce the 2021 funded amount by $20,000. Move a little. Okay, yeah, kind of covered this. I'm going to, in the interest of time, move forward a little bit. All right, so a second option is to is really just for grantees with outstanding Section 108 guarantee balances. So you may consider actually paying down some of your Section 108 balances with your 2016 grant. So if this is of interest, contact the Section 108 office using the email on the screen as soon as possible. So they will work with you, but it does take some time to processing, so you don't want to kind of leave it till the end. There are other actions that grantees, especially those with larger balances, may also consider if you don't see your current trajectory as spending enough of your 2016 grant funds. It's a more proactive approach and borrows some of the techniques that many of grantees have used to accelerate expenditures when you're trying to meet your annual CDBG time limit standards. So you can find some great resources on CDBG timeliness on the HUD Exchange that are worth checking out in these cases. And those also address sort of longer term expenditure issues. We're kind of focusing in today's webinar on sort of the specific 2016 funds, but you also want to think about making sure that you're setting yourself up for future success. So you may need to look more broadly at activities that may benefit from increased funding this summer. So do you have any activities with a high demand for services and you can increase their funding and delivery schedule? If so, you can reach out to your partner agencies and subrecipients with existing programs and actually encourage them to accelerate their programs, or even see if they could benefit from more funding. And then states and urban counties, some of which are on this call today, can reach out to your local units of government as well. You may also be able to accelerate some payment schedules for infrastructure or other projects. So for example, you can make an interim payment on a large infrastructure project rather than waiting until the end. Of course, you do need to make sure that any work you pay for is actually completed and that it meets the CDBG requirements. So, you don't want to put yourself at risk. So if really needed, maybe even have a new project that could be quickly launched without cutting any corners, especially completing the environment this summer and to do some draws on. And then finally, don't forget about the planning and admin activities where grantees have often a steady cost that potentially could be accelerated. But to do that, we do need to mention one key caveat. So the big caution is to make sure you remain in compliance with both the planning and admin cap tests. So here you can look at the two CDBG financial reports for entitlements and for the PR 28 for states. So you have the program year test, and in this case, we'll talk about the PR 26 CDBG financial summary report, which evaluates and looks at the overall obligations and expenditures on your planning and admin activities during the program year. So this cap does not consider the source year of the grant funding for use of the admin activities, and can even be increased if you say get some program income. So most grantees are pretty familiar with this test and are careful to stay under the 20% planning and admin cap. But you also want to be particularly careful about the second PA cap, planning and admin cap, where the grantees cannot spend more than 20% of each entitlement grant on planning and admin activities. So the source year planning and admin cap, which this deals with, is again, for the 2016 grant, is just 20% of your 2016 entitlement grant. And it doesn't increase if you receive program income. So you can use, again, the PR 26 activity summary by selected grantee to evaluate that spending cap anytime during the year. And we don't really have time to go into details of reports here, but there's some great resources in the HUD Exchange. And then we can cover more as it relates to your 2016 grant during the office hours that we'll talk about later, and so forth. So there's one new consideration when identifying activities to move your 2016 grant funds to. HUD is just now implementing some new grant closeout requirements for CDBG and other grants. And one of the key requirements is that a grant cannot be closed until all activities that are funded with that grant year are completed. So if possible, not always possible, but if possible, you do want to avoid putting your 2016 grant funds into an activity that will not be completed for years. So, for example, I'd be pretty hesitant to use my 2016 grant funds for acquisition of a property for, say, affordable housing development using home funds. Is these kinds of activities, developments could take time, they can encounter issues and so forth. So for more information on the grant closeout, there's the notice CPD 2214. Two final things we do want to highlight as you develop your spending plan. First is communicating soon with your stakeholders is just critical. We do suggest that that the program and finance staff have a meeting to agree on a spending plan and make sure that the 2016 funds are committed and drawn according to the plan. You may want to contact your subrecipients or units of local government to make sure that they submit their invoices early, so it allows you enough time to review and draw down funds before the deadline. And then a second important point, we have discussed various options that may involve swapping different year grants or even reallocating unexpended funds to new projects. So these changes may require an amendment to your action plan. So do please review your citizen participation plan to see any of these actions trigger a substantial amendment for your action plan, or even potentially consolidated plan. And don't forget to build that into your timeline. And again, if you have questions, really encourage you to contact your CPD rep for any guidance on the action plan requirements or additional policy questions. And with that, I'll pass the mic on to Rob for some resources and opportunities for direct technical assistance.
All right, thank you, John. Appreciate it. Yeah, we'd like to highlight a few resources here. These links will be live in the slides that are posted on the HUD Exchange. And I will during Q&A. I'll drop some really quickly in the chat here in just a minute. We do want to remind you that HUD will be offering office hours to meet with the TA provider. The link will be sent out from HUD Exchange, so make sure you're subscribed. I think I've dropped that link in a couple times into the chat, but go to HUD Exchange and make sure that you're subscribed to news regarding IDIS. To prepare for your appointment, make sure you've looked at your 2016 balance, you know where those funds are, and write out your questions so we have them ready. And now we will, right at the hour. Do we want to take some time to have Q&A?
We are at the hour mark. But if somebody's been monitoring, and particularly, I think some have been answered directly, if there were any that comes up that you think would be widely shared, we could do so. Take just a couple minutes. For those that have to leave, we understand this will be recorded and put up there on the HUD Exchange. Hopefully within a matter of days. We're going to try to move really quickly on this.
One thing I thought maybe I would mention, I saw a question about returning funds returning 2016 funds now. And so we just want to make a point that when you're getting close to the expenditure deadline, you want to really be sure, if you are returning funds, that you've checked with your field office, that you have time to return them and revise them back and respend them. But in no cases would you ever want to return funds to your line of credit after the expiration date, because those funds will be swept by Treasury. So there are, as I mentioned earlier, 2 different ways to return funds. So always check with your field office representative before returning funds, so you don't return expired funds. Just thought that might be helpful. Thank you.
And Robert, I don't know if you were monitoring any. I think you were answering some direct questions. Was there anything particularly that you think would be important for everybody to know? Not to, and if not, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, thank you. I do see one question that I can answer live. It's about CDBG funds having an 8-year expenditure period. The way this is counted, it is 8 years, but the way it's counted is it counts the whole fiscal year, including the year of the allocation. So right now, the 2016 funds are going to cancel this September. So you count the whole 2016 fiscal year. It's 1, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. That's 8 years, fiscal years. So in calendar years, for you guys, by the time you get your funding, it really works out to like a little over 7 years in your period of performance.
Thanks. Robert, is there anything else that we wanted to cover, or we can?
No, I think that's
a
if
few
you,
minutes
if you
over
do need
schedule.
if you do have more questions, please sign up for the office hours and also use ask a question. Make sure you select IDIS as your the pool that you want it to go to, so it goes to the correct pool and we can answer as quickly as possible. Yeah, I'll just thank everyone. And thanks Susan, John for presenting, and Laura for creating the presentation, handling Q&A. Thanks for the Cloudburst team behind the scenes. And also our guests from HUD, Robert Peterson, Jane Wilson, and Aaron Martin. Please do take advantage of the many resources on the HUD Exchange. Many of those we have linked to here, and feel free to explore HUD Exchange for all the many resources. As I mentioned, the slide deck, transcript, and recording will be available in about 1 to 2 weeks. Thanks again to HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development, CPD, for making today's webinar possible. And that concludes today's webinar.
Thank you.